Nick said he did not want to be a father. He especially didn't want to be a father to someone else's kids. And Diane had 3 kids and wanted to be a surrogate and have more children. And so that was not going to work out for them. Nick was actually very startled by kind of the nonchalant outlook Diane had about her kids and about these affairs. He was startled that she typically had affairs while the kids were witness to it all with this rotating door of men. And he was not comfortable with any part of that. And so Nick wouldn't see her unless the kids were with a babysitter. Like he would show up to the house, and if the kids were there, he would leave. And so Diane kind of started to realize she had to do something with the kids in order to be with Nick. So in her talks of marriage and a future together with Nick, she had drawn up plans for a home that she envisioned building. A home where the kids' rooms would be on the opposite side of the house, allowing Nick to rarely see them. She also promised that when the kids were home, she would have a nanny that would take care of them. Essentially, she made plans to live out a fairy tale love story with Nick while pretending that her children didn't exist. And that right there shows the kind of lengths Diane was willing to go to make sure she could be with Nick. Even from the get-go, she was willing to not see her children, put them with a nanny full time, and legitimately build a house from the ground up designed specifically to keep them away. She continued on with this plan of building this house. She was going to have a second surrogacy and use that money to build this home. And in the meantime, she secured an apartment for her and Nick to share. Nick did stay there, but only a handful of times. But even then, she took it a step further and got his name with a rose tattooed on her shoulder. She really seemed to want to show him how invested she was in their relationship. And she so desperately wanted him to reciprocate these same things. She begged him to get a matching one. It was like she was not going to be satisfied until there was some permanent reminder that he belonged to her. And when things didn't go her way, she would show up with whiskey, get her male suitors drunk, and take advantage of them. She did this time and time again. It was like her personal affair MO. So Nick ended up drunk and with a tattoo of a rose and her name, which, whoo, that's a lot. And, I won't deny that Nick played a part in this. He seemed to enjoy the thrill to some extent. Obviously, he kept on going with it. Manipulation's a huge factor, but he did seem to like playing with fire. However, he also had his limits. And eventually, he had had enough. Diane just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and telling him to leave his wife and telling him to be with her. And it just got so overwhelming for him. And it didn't matter what he said, she would not accept that that wasn't going to happen. And so finally, Nick fully ended things with her, and she retaliated. Again, a pattern that she has shown throughout all of her years of life. When someone did something that was so absolute and she couldn't change it, she did something to hurt them right back. She told Nick that she had an STD, forcing him to come clean to his wife about the affair on his birthday. She just kind of dropped this bomb and disappeared because right as she decided to do this, she had hopped on a plane, STD and all, heading to become a surrogate mom for the second time. Now, when Diane returned, the pregnancy hadn't taken, which I'm sure was a huge blow to her, which was followed by another blow because her plan to end Nick's marriage didn't work out. If anything, his relationship with his wife was even stronger. Now that she kind of knew what was going on, that there had been an affair, which, by the way, she already knew everything about, that she had actually kept like an entire track of all the times that she thought Nick was out having an affair. And Diane also kept a calendar where she marked all the times they were together as well. So like there was so much information to kind of corroborate all of these stories. They both kind of figured out this is not what we want. We want to have our marriage work out. We're going to move forward. And Diane just like could not comprehend that someone would want to do that. And so she became irritated and kind of started to target his wife now. She was writing letters to his wife. She would call his home several times a day, and then each time his wife would pick up and she would hang up. It seemed like she was hoping to scare his wife enough that she would just leave Nick. Like she was so dedicated and unwavering in her efforts to get what she wanted that she knew she didn't care how long it took. Eventually, she would wear somebody down. And so frustration just grew when her tactics didn't seem to be working. And so one day, Diane cornered Nick and she asked him, "Who do you love? Choose one of us." And He didn't choose her. And so, in a fit of rage, Diane followed him home and proceeded to bang on his doors for hours throughout the night. She was so upset after this that she actually went to Steve, had a huge argument with him where she threatened to kill him and then get rid of herself. And she actually took the 22 Ruger handgun in question into the bathroom of her trailer and shot a hole through the floor. So she clearly became incredibly emotionally distressed when she felt like she lost, when she felt like she didn't get what she wanted, which again plays a huge part in this case. Now, Nick and his wife eventually left for Arizona to get away from Diane for a bit. She was just relentless in her pursuit. And unfortunately, Diane found the number of the home he was staying at and proceeded to harass him there as well. And so at this point, he is irritated. His wife is so irritated. They're done with it. And so I think she realized that she would have to do something drastic. She needed him to feel as though he had completely lost her because she believed it would bring him running back. And so in April of 1983, she decided to move to Oregon with her parents. According to Diane's own diary, despite being met with a harsh rejection from Nick during this time, and even his wife literally yelled at her to F off and slammed the door in her face, Diane fell deeper into her delusion that this was all just a show. She was like, nope, he's just doing this so that, the divorce goes well and he can be with me. Like, this is all for me, which is just some unhinged behavior. Authorities read her diaries from this time period, right when she moved to Oregon, and the entire time she was still very steadily expressing her love for Nick and her excitement for him to eventually move to Oregon with her. She was settling into her new life. She was fantasizing about all of the things that Nick would love there and what they would do together. She was incredibly excited, but she still hadn't really given up her old ways at all. The moment she hit the ground of Oregon and got this job with USPS, she started having another affair with a married man there. So this just seemed to be a cycle she could not break herself from. But even with this man she was having an affair with, she still spoke about Nick to this guy, saying, oh yeah, he's going to come and marry me. She was telling this to her coworkers. She was talking about him like he was actively someone she was seeing, rather than an old flame that had literally just ran to another state to get away from her. However, a few weeks after moving to Oregon, it seemed like she kind of began to regain some sense of reality, that she could no longer keep pretending things were going the way she hoped they would, and face what's actually happening. She called Nick every single day and got no answer. And so when that didn't work, she started to make daily calls to the post office at 7 a.m. trying to reach him, which Nick refused to respond. He told everyone at the office, if she calls for me, I'm not there. So when that didn't work, she started to send letters. And when those letters went unanswered, she started to send packages and flowers. And when those were returned to her, she left them to rot in the trunk of her car and made a 24-hour trip to Arizona. Clearly, something had clicked that he doesn't want to talk to me. He doesn't want these things. And it felt like she thought maybe seeing him in person was going to change that. So she left her kids behind, hopped on a flight, stayed with Steve, of all people, and went to go see Nick. She claimed in her diary that Nick had given her a necklace out of love. It was a promise, a necklace that was so special to him. And he told her that he never took it off his neck ever. And the next time it would go on his neck was when he came to Oregon to be with her. It sounded like a beautiful love story, something out of a Nicholas Sparks movie. However, Nick spoke about the exact same moment in a very different way. He told police that he had given Diane this necklace as collateral for $500 that she lent him before he moved. So once again, we've got these two entirely different perspectives and stories, but that just seems to be typical with Diane. So she went back when he stopped replying to her, followed him on his route, and approached him in the street to return his necklace to him. In her diary, she continued on writing that they spoke during this time and expressed their love for each other, that they continued to make promises to each other to eventually be together in Oregon. But again, Nick said that that's not at all what happened. He was horrified to see her. He said that when she moved away, when she decided to go to Oregon, the moment he knew that she had crossed state lines, it was like a weight was lifted off of his shoulders and he could breathe again. So when she suddenly popped up, of all places, following him on his work route, he was terrified and said that he barely said all but 20 words to her. He had thought it was finally over and hoped that getting that necklace back was her also agreeing with that. But her diary showed that's not at all how she viewed the situation. Nick continued to tell the authorities that he never intended to go to Oregon. That was never anything that I guess he had planned or said to her. He had been trying to find a way for quite some time to permanently distance himself from her. She just wasn't getting the memo. And around May 5th, just before the attack, Diane's diary entries took a significant turn. This was around the time she had returned the necklace when she really, I think, realized Nick was not going to be there. Nick was not flying up. He was not leaving his wife. It was over. The police noted that she started to fluctuate between still professing her love for Nick to questioning what went wrong. She blamed his wife for ruining their relationship, and then sometimes she would write diary entries acting as if she was so done with him, like it was not a big deal. Her diary entries read, quote, "Well, sweetie, I love talking to you, but I have my own life here. I have 3 beautiful children that I love more than anyone else. I think I even love them more than you now. They stand by me no matter what." And again, just another example of the priorities that Diane had. And for the first time ever, Diane began to focus her diary entries on her kids. She wrote about their trips that they took. She described each child's personality. And Rule said it perfectly that it seemed like she was noticing her children for the first time ever. Her coworkers also told authorities that they observed a shift during this time as well. Diane went from being happy and bubbly and so excited that Nick was coming to now she was depressed and she seemed stuck in her thoughts. And all of this was literally within 2 weeks of the shooting. Then on May 12th, the behavior in her journal continued to just become even stranger. On the 12th itself, Diane mentioned that she had gone out to buy a golden unicorn for her children. And she, for some reason, kept stressing in the diary that she had to engrave it with the date of May 13th. Like, not the day that she bought it, but for the following day. And authorities could not figure out why she would want to do that. What was the significance of the 13th? And so they went to her journal entry for the 13th. Diane had written a very lengthy entry detailing how she took her kids out legitimately from sunup to beyond sundown, which does not seem like something they normally did together. They went to the beach. I think it took like hours to drive there, and then they came back home and they visited a handful of parks. She kept taking them from one park to another, to the river, to another park. And she even noted in her diary that although the kids were tired and hungry, she refused to take them home. And so authorities raised the question, why did she keep them out for so long? Why was she just bouncing them around again and again and again? And so at this point, authorities speculated that Diane may have been documenting a premeditated plan to harm her children. This bizarre pattern continued day after day after the 13th, up until the day of the shootings. Every single diary account, she took the kids out late into the night to different parks, different rivers, different isolated areas. Again, it was almost as if she was kind of tumbling the idea around in her head of doing something drastic, but she couldn't quite stick to doing it. However, on the 19th, there was an abrupt change. There was no diary entry at all for the first time ever, day of the shooting. All that was there was the date, and Diane never wrote anything else. So all of this work helped paint an actual picture of Diane's life, of what happened in the year leading up to the shootings and the week leading up to the shootings. And it detailed a history of Diane's own awful childhood, her own abusive and neglectful behavior towards her children, the choices she made repeatedly to put her own desires and needs in front of her kids. And now they also had forensic evidence to consider. The forensic examination of the car did not support Diane's story that she had given authorities. There was high velocity backspatter found on the outside of the car, just beneath the passenger side door on the rocker panel. Now, if you remember, Diane claimed that everyone was asleep in the car and she was outside of the car on the driver's side. How would blood have gotten on the rocker panel on the outside of the car on the passenger side? So, high velocity backspatter occurs when blood is expelled from a wound and it kind of goes directly towards whatever caused the injury. So, in this case, the gun. And this indicated that someone had been shot by the attacker who was inside of the car while the victim was outside. And when they did blood testing, which they didn't have like DNA testing at the time, they were able to confirm that this blood matched Cheryl's. It was the same blood type, which was interesting because Cheryl had been shot in the back 2 times. Now, further testing revealed that the victim had to have been at ground level when they were shot outside of the car because the spatter was just inches off of the ground. I think 9 inches was the highest it went. And so police started to theorize that Cheryl had tried to get away, that she had turned to get out of the car and was shot once in the back. She managed to open the door and kind of fell out of the car, and then she was shot again in the back while on the ground. So obviously, that completely changes the story because Diane never mentioned any of the kids being outside of the car or that she had to physically pick up any of her children to put them back inside of the car. Additionally, investigators noted that despite Diane having been shot, there weren't really any smears of blood on the steering wheel or in any area on the driver's side of the car. And even in her own reenaction, she shows that she kicks the person out of the way, pushes them, jumps in the car, and immediately puts the keys in and grabs the steering wheel to go. And so she was bleeding down her arm. Like that would have gotten all over the steering wheel, all over these places, but it didn't. And so this suggested to authorities that she had possibly prepared to cover her arm and clean herself up with that towel before getting into the car to drive away. And if there was an active person shooting your family, shooting you, you're not going to be like, oh, I'm jumping in the car, and before I touch anything, I'm going to grab my towel and like wipe myself off, clean my hands, cover my arm, and then I'll drive away. Like it becomes a very frantic, immediate thing. And then there were the bullets. Authorities searched endlessly for the gun. They had chased down leads in Arizona and California. They crawled under her old trailer where she shot that hole through the floor, trying to find like a 22 caliber casing that had come out of that specific gun, believed to possibly be involved, to compare it, and they just couldn't find it. And it was actually a really frustrating situation because they had to go back to the person that gave Steve the gun in order to get the serial number. And so this man gave them the number, and it actually turned up in Paris, California. And so detectives went there thinking, finally, we've got the gun. But then when they compared things, nothing was matching. And so when they went back to the guy to be like, we just want to confirm this is the right gun, the man that gave the gun to Steve actually came back and said that he had purchased 2 Rugers, 222 handguns in the same time period over like a couple of days. And he believed he actually gave the other one to Steve and not the one just found in Paris, California. And so he then went and got all of his documentation proving there was this second gun, what the new serial number was, and gave all that information to authorities. So again, they were back at square one. And that entire time they'd been searching for this one gun, and now it was proven to be something different. So they decided to look at what they already have. And obviously the 22 rifle had not been shot. It was filled with dust like all the way down the barrel, and the 38 was the exact same way. Plus it didn't match the caliber of weapon used, but they noticed that there were 2 unfired rounds inside of the 22 rifle. But when they looked at them closer, those 2 rounds had been worked through a gun before, and it wasn't the 22 rifle that they were in. And so they decided to look at the markings that are unique to each gun that they've been worked through and compare that to the casings and things that they found from the car, from the scene on Old Mohawk Road, because they did find some casings and things there. And they ended up finding that those unfired rounds and the 22 rifle in Diane's home matched the markings on those from the crime scene. They had been worked through the same gun, and the only way that's possible is if those 2 unfired rounds and the 22 rifle had at some point been in the gun used to shoot the children. The 22 that Steve and now several others in Arizona, including Nick, said that Diane had. Nick had made it very clear to authorities that just the day before she left, he saw her, and in her trunk was a 22 Ruger handgun, the same one he knew her to have. So obviously, she had that gun. It was something she was planning on taking to Oregon with her. And throughout the entirety of the investigation, they actually ended up getting Nick to record phone calls with Diane, thinking that maybe he would be able to get her to release some sort of information. And in the book Small Sacrifices, there's some excerpts from some of their conversations. And Nick confronted her saying, I saw that 22 Ruger in the back of your trunk. And the verbiage that she uses when she responds to him is so wildly and obviously manipulative. She's like, no, you remember what you actually saw is XYZ. No, what you actually remember is a week prior. Like every time she would be approached with information from someone who had seen it personally, she would try to alter their memories of it. It's so creepy hearing her talk to them the way that she did.
Where were you when the shooting was going on?
By the back, the little wing, the little triangle-shaped wing.
Why weren't you kicking the boy in the balls or something?
Because I was frozen.
Well, okay, that's a good enough answer.
I'm sorry, and I'm ashamed of it, but I saw him. I knew he was mad at me, and I just never assumed anybody would hurt the kids. And I saw him reach towards the car, and my first thought was to look at the kids, because they're part of me. And I saw Christie get shot, and I just froze. My mind completely locked until he swung around towards me again. And that's when he hit my hand with the gun.
Well, when you told me the first time you called when you called me at the post office, something about throwing your keys or pretending to throw your keys or some shit. When did that happen?
It didn't.
Oh, okay.
But I had to give a good reason that I got away. I couldn't just tell him that he walked away from me.
Well, why not?
Because that's the truth. And the guy said I better not tell the truth.
The guy that did the shooting?
Yeah.
Diane, you better go talk to the police.
At this point, authorities were starting to build a pretty solid case, and to Diane's shock and horror, everything around her was starting to crumble. She wasn't sure exactly what evidence the police had. There had still been no arrest, not even of her. It seemed to her that she felt it was coming. The media and others began to question her story as well, and one infamous interview in particular kind of showed just how unsettling her behavior was. And I find it very interesting. This was done by Ann Yeager, and she was a very young journalist. And the interview was so jarring. Even Anne did not expect it. It was pre-recorded, that she decided to not release it. Like, she said morally she couldn't do it because some really horrific things were said. And Diane would have absolutely no chance at receiving a fair trial, which, innocent till proven guilty, everyone deserves a fair trial. It's not really fair to put that kind of information out there. And so it wasn't released until after a jury had already been picked and were told to not look at any of the news. And in this interview, she says that everyone calls her lucky.
Everybody says you sure were lucky. Well, I don't feel very lucky. I couldn't tie my damn shoes for about 2 months. It is very painful. It is still painful. I have a steel plate on my arm. I will for 1.5 years. The scar is going to be there forever. I'm going to remember that night for the rest of my life, whether I want to or not. I don't think I was very lucky. I think my kids were lucky. If I had been shot the way they were, we all would have died. The thing that really, really haunts me the most is not even the sight and the sound. I mean, the sound and the smell are fading. But at night, when I close my eyes, I can see Christie reaching her hand out to me while I'm driving, and the blood just keep coming out of her mouth. And that, maybe it'll fade too with time, but I don't think so. That haunts me the most.
Ann Yeager went on to say in a 2020 episode that was more recently released in, ironically, 2020, that this was such a disturbing interview for her to film. She said that the way that Diane so grotesquely and nonchalantly spoke about her children's wounds and blood gushing from their mouth, and just the way she described things, showing not a single ounce of emotion. Meanwhile, Ann Yeager, I had to ask her to stop because she was about to vomit on set. She was so upset and disturbed. There was such a clear disconnect, and so detectives brought Diane in for another interview. They were armed with new information, and it was going to be an interesting ride because, being who she was, she either hated the cops completely because they were men, or she would at times seduce them. Like, she tried to get real close to one of the investigators, trying to meet him in private. She always felt like she had this upper hand, and she had even tried to kind of exert that control over the people overlooking the case, but this interview was not going to go how she expected. The investigators pushed hard. They were demanding answers to the difficult questions, and they were explaining to her, why these things weren't adding up. They're like, look, this is what you said. This is the evidence we found. It does not support anything you're saying. Something's got to give. And Diane was mad. She was absolutely spitting fire. Again, you can listen to portions of the interview on the 2020 episode. They offered her several chances within her rights to leave. They're like, look, you don't have to be here. If this is frustrating you, if you don't want to answer these questions, go. It's recorded several times throughout the interview, but each time she didn't want to. She wanted to argue. She wanted to keep going. They had gotten her started at this point, and it was bound to end with something coming out. And sure enough, she changed the story. Now, this was not the first time she changed the story, and it had actually been going on for months at this point. All of a sudden, it transforms from a bushy-haired stranger that she didn't recognize to now it's two people with ski masks, and they both know me by name, and they even knew about my tattoo. I mean, she claimed these people knew specific details about her life. She claimed that one of these two men was pacing far away while the other was sitting close up just staring at her. She said that she ripped a ski mask from one of their faces. I mean, it went from this was so quick to now she's like sitting here having like arguments with these people, and they're trying to figure out what to do, and her kids are just lying bleeding in the car. She also started to say that the people that had attacked her had threatened to harm her if she told. She even went on to say at times that this was someone hired by Steve, that these people suggested that if Steve couldn't have her and couldn't have the kids, then nobody would, like they had been hired. Other times, she said she was unsure who they were, why they targeted her. Her favorite thing seemed to be coming out with just this bombshell information that she had been harboring forever, and then she would twist it and try to say she had been harboring it because she had her own reasons, but she never ever got specific. She gave them just enough information to seemingly throw the entire investigation, but could never come up with any proof for it. And finally, she ended the interview in a fit of rage. When she had finally been confronted with every single inconsistency, she claimed all of a sudden to know who the attacker was.
Come on, Diane. It's your turn at bat.
Since you guys seem to think that I should have brought Diane with me, I will get it myself, because I know who did it.
You do know who did it?
Yes, I do. I damn sure do.
You know him by name?
Yes, I do, yeah.
You saw him shoot your kids?
Yeah.
It's pretty important.
And I saw him grab my arm and yank my arm out and shoot my arm and say, now try to get away with it. And I'm leaving because I know who did it. Bye.
The time is now 17:46, and Diane is just departed the office. We're concluding the tape.
Why? Why would Diane use her knowledge of who the attacker is as a defense against detectives accusing her of being involved? It literally does not matter which way you look at it. It does not make sense. First and foremost, that information could have been her ticket to freedom. She was so worried about them focusing on her wrongfully and that they weren't doing the right thing. They weren't going after the wrong guy. Yet she's now claiming she's known this guy the entire time and is now refusing to share that information. And she can't sit there and say she's scared of him, because if she was genuinely scared of this guy, she wouldn't have been sitting on the news talking about how she wanted him caught. She wouldn't be blatantly dangling how much she can't stand him in front of his face, knowing he could come and harm her. There is not a shred of logic in what she did. And that seemed to really just be enough to seal the deal for everybody. And during this time, the sheriff's department actually was working alongside Pierce Brooks. And that should be a name a lot of you guys probably recognize. He was the lead homicide investigator in the Onion Field investigation. And he also was the first person to pioneer the profiling and tracking of serial killers, like finding out how these people work and the psychology behind it and what they might do next. And all of of these things. And so he looked at all of the information and was like, you've definitely got your person. So as authorities were working to button up their investigation, Diane continued fighting with her attorney to gain custody of her children. But the evidence against her was still just mounting. Her portrayal as a good mother seemed at this point to be nothing more than a publicity stunt. She would take her kids cakes and presents every birthday and holiday, but always with the presence of several news stations that she asked to be there. She'd be like, hey, guess what? I'm taking my kid a birthday cake. Meet me at the bakery at 3. And she would make sure someone was there when she picked up the cake, and then make sure someone was there when she dropped it off, and make sure they got the perfect shots of her upset that she wasn't able to be with her children. I mean, it was such a diabolical plan that she seemed to have in place. But of all this evidence that they were collecting, the most damning evidence yet was Christie. Christie had been released from the hospital on June 22nd to a well-known and well-loved foster family in the area. She worked hard with therapists and other specialists to regain her speech and build her confidence and trust, which was going to take a long time because she didn't trust anyone at this point, understandably. Psychologists and those that interacted with her in this time frame had made notes that she very much seemed like a little mom. Like she had no idea how to be anything other than someone that takes care of somebody else. And at just 8 years old, that's so incredibly devastating. Her foster mom noted that she also seemed to be so worried that this foster mom was going somewhere. And every morning and in the middle of the night and random times, Christie would come and check to make sure her foster mom was still there. You could just see all the ways that the trauma in her life had gone on to so horribly affect her, and all the fears that she had, even if they were unspoken, they were so obviously there. Now, just before leaving the hospital, Christie was actually able to speak for the first time. She spoke for the first time on June 16th, which I personally find very interesting because the last time her mother was able to see her before her custody and everything was taken away was June 15th. So I find it interesting that Christie finally was able to speak for the first time after her mom was no longer able to see her anymore. And even though it wasn't a massive statement, she was still, recovering from a stroke. It was very small words and yes, no, and things like that. It was still a very significant statement because she indicated that her mom told her not to tell anyone what happened. It was clear to everyone involved that something had occurred involving Diane, and Christie was not at all comfortable talking about it. She didn't even want to talk about her mom. She didn't say her name. She didn't express any interest in seeing her mom after she left the hospital. They noted that any mention of her mom would pretty much shut her down completely. She would entirely stop communicating. However, she gradually began to let people in. She mentioned slowly but surely that no one but her family was in or around the car the night of the shooting. And while speaking to her therapist, she even began to write down who attacked her on a piece of paper. And they didn't want to force her into giving this information. And so her therapist said, look, if you want to write this down on a piece of paper, just to get it off your chest, like just to have a moment to be free from it, you can do that. And he was like, I'm not going to look at it. You can throw it in the fire before you leave, and it can be kept as your secret until you're ready to share it. And so Christie did that. After every session, she would write down something, and then at the end of the session, she'd throw it in the fire and then go on about her time. But this just confirmed to them even more that she was very well aware of who shot her. They also created anatomically correct dolls and dressed them in the children's clothing, so it was something recognizable, and Christie immediately gravitated towards Cheryl's, which broke my heart to hear. And during this time, she was asked to act out what happened in the car during one of her therapy sessions. And so she literally assembled the entire living room into a replica of the car using chairs and the couch, and she placed each doll exactly where the children had been. And then they asked her to play her mother, to play Diane. However, none of what Christie did next matched her mother's recorded reenactment. Instead, Christie went to what would be the trunk of her imaginary car and grabbed something that, based on her gestures, resembled a gun. She walked to the driver's seat, ducking her head underneath, again, the imaginary door frame, and she pointed her finger at the dolls and she said, bang. At the same time, Christie made the choice to no longer throw away her neatly folded paper in the fire. Instead, she allowed them to look at it. And inside of that little paper, Christie had written, "My mom." Fred Hughey had been put through the ringer by his own sheriff's department and Diane and her attorney and the public and the media. Why haven't you made an arrest yet? If you thought I was guilty, then why haven't I been arrested? Like, there was just all of this noise, and he knew that his patience would eventually pay off. He didn't know if he would ever find the gun. He didn't know if Christie would ever talk again. He just knew that if he stuck to it and continued investigating and the sheriff's department continued working, they would either eventually have what they needed to proceed with charges against Diane or whoever was involved, or unfortunately, this would end up being a devastating cold case for the state of Oregon. But Christie had just cracked it wide open. This significant revelation made so many things neatly fall into place. All of these questions that they had, they were now able to answer. A witness had come forward saying that he had actually been driving on Old Mohawk Road the night of the shootings at 10:15. So we're talking about immediately in the emergent time frame of when this shooting occurred and when Diane said she was flying down that road to get her children help. This man said that he pulled up behind Christie's red Nissan Pulsar at 10:15, and he remembered it so vividly because her car was going so slow that it wouldn't even register on his speedometer. So they were going 5 to 6 miles per hour down this backcountry road. He said that he followed her car for about 2 minutes before turning off in a different direction. And that entire time, he heard no screams for help. Diane didn't yell that her kids had been shot. She wasn't in a hurry at all. So despite her claims that she was driving fast, this witness and the coagulated blood and the missing time were all starting to make sense. It seemed like Diane was waiting for all of her kids to die, or at least get close enough to death to make it look like she had brought them in for help, look like she had done the right thing. But knowing that it was already too late, they weren't going to survive. It seemed like she hadn't accounted for Christie literally dying, coming back to life, having a stroke, losing her voice, and then working so hard to regain it. And so some of her behavior when Christie ended up being okay, again, kind of made authorities feel like she was trying to do things to keep Christie quiet. The first time when she was able to see her children, she didn't go to Danny first. She went immediately to Christie. She grabbed Christie's hand and stared into her eyes. Was she trying to convey some sort of threat? Is that why Christie's heart rate absolutely skyrocketed when her mom walked in? In her own interviews, Diane said that Christie would be the only one able to save her, but this was when it was not guaranteed she was ever going to talk again. They didn't know if she would ever be able to speak and say what had happened. Again, it seemed like her planting a seed, so when future information came out, everyone else were the ones that sounded crazy. This also explained why she didn't want that amazing woman there comforting her children, why she didn't want security personnel, therapists, detectives, anyone that was talking to her children presented an opportunity for Christie to say what had actually happened. And that enraged her enough to make her want to literally take her children, relying on hospital equipment, away from the hospital. It also made them even more upset about something that had actually happened in secret. Diane had somehow, when this investigation was ongoing, tricked Steve into allowing her to see their kids. Her custody had been taken, and that was like the first blow. And when her behavior continued to be threatening, they took away her visitation rights as well. But Steve, on the other hand, he was able to see the kids and eventually was granted the ability to take them from the foster home and spend time with them outside. And so she played on his heartstrings, and he let Christie leave with Diane alone. Why just Christie? Why not Christie and Danny? So again, that same question, Steve said he didn't feel threatened at all initially, that he still didn't believe Diane would do anything to her kids. But when Diane failed to bring Christie back at the promised time, something in him said, hey, these people might not be joking. She may have done something. And he was about to call the police, like about ready to send himself to jail for violating an order. But in that same moment, Diane pulled into the parking lot. Christie was finally returned, and she didn't say a word. No one did. And so those that cared for her, the doctors, her foster parents, couldn't understand why all of a sudden she seemed to regress so into her previous state where she didn't want to talk. She didn't want to be open. She was extremely withdrawn. Did she just want to take Christie to again tell her not to tell anyone what really happened? And the most twisted part of the story that again gives you some insight into Diane's mind, after she convinced Steve to letting her see her kids, Steve decided he wanted to try to gain full custody of the children, and this infuriated her. So in retaliation, which I said earlier is a pattern for her, she decided to come up with this convoluted method of letting authorities find out what Steve had done and letting her see the kids. And this was not the first time she had done something like this. I think when Steve told authorities that she had a .22 Ruger, in retaliation, she called Arizona police and let them in on an arson he was involved in. It was actually the arson of her trailer. It was something that she planned, but she was so mad she called the police and pinned him for it. And so this was absolutely no different. And she legitimately admits to doing this in interviews. She ended up writing a letter to Nick, and she said that he had been ignoring her letters, which we all already know. And so she knew she had to get his attention some way. So she started to call the post office obsessively, pretending to be in a panic about the letter she sent him, insisting them that they warn him not to open it at any cost. Naturally, he opened it. And inside, she revealed her secret meeting with Christie. And Nick, horrified, gave all of that information to the police. And guess who was the one who got in trouble for that? Diane is such a diabolical woman. But all of these things were kind of just clicking into place like a perfectly fit puzzle piece of why Diane was doing the things she did, why she was acting the way she was, why she was hyper-focused on Christie. Because Christie had seen what actually happened. And Christie bravely shared her story. During all of those months when they were hearing all this information from Christie, there was also a grand jury that was occurring in regard to Diane and what happened to her children. And so one by one, every single person that was in Diane's life was summoned to speak to the grand jury. The testimony is secret, which we all know, but it essentially was filled with all of the things that authorities had already found from all of the people who went to testify. Her own sister had even told authorities that her initial thought when hearing that the kids had been shot and Diane was shot, she believed that Diane was responsible, and she stuck by that. I don't know if she still does. I'm not going to speak for her, but at one point she immediately thought Diane did this to her children. And with all of that, they decided that it was time to make an arrest. And on February 28th, 1984, Diane Downs was arrested on her way to work. And they said that it was so obvious she knew it was coming. She just kind of smirked at authorities and went about her way. Diane was charged with 1 count of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder against her own children. And there were, I believe, a few other counts of aggravated assault. However, Diane had another trick up her sleeve. Diane's trial, just like the entire investigation so far, was highly publicized. It was expected to last for quite a few weeks, and there were 2 very distinct camps forming. There were the hardcore supporters of Diane and those who wanted her imprisoned as soon as possible. So everyone was sitting and waiting on pins and needles to see, how Diane was going to be when she came into the hearing. Everyone was so aware of how she portrayed herself because she was on the news so often that they were just interested to see how the change was going to be when she got there. But she brought something even more surprising. She showed up to her trial pregnant, which I guess technically is probably not all that surprising. When she was in her downward spiral, when people were starting to question her involvement, people in town were no longer really talking to her, none of the men in town showed any interest in her, she got that itch again. She needed that happiness to fill that void that just never ever went away. And so she very specifically targeted a man on her postal route. Just as she always had, she showed up with that whiskey, she showed up with some weed, and she was ready for a good time. This man was very hesitant, according to interviews that he did for the book by Anne Rule. He didn't want people to think weird things because he was with Diane Downs, who half the population believed had shot her children, but he also couldn't help but kind of give to the way that Diane seduced men. And so they started having this risky fling that turned into the exact same game that Diane had played with Nick. He didn't expect it to be more than a one-time thing, but Diane would not stop. She showed up at his house uninvited and unexpectedly. She knew where he worked. She knew his favorite places to hang out. There was no escaping protecting Diane. Every moment that he thought she finally was gone, she would all of a sudden literally be at his doorstep with food, welcoming herself inside the house. That was Diane's way of getting what she wanted, was by never even giving you a chance to say no to begin with. And then one night she wrote in her diary that she had an idea.
I got pregnant because I miss Christie and I miss Danny and I miss Cheryl so much. I'm never going to see Cheryl on earth again. And you can't replace children, but you can replace the effect that they give you. And they give me love, they give me satisfaction, they give me stability, they give me a reason to live and a reason to be happy, and that's gone. They took it from me. But children are so easy to conceive.
Obviously, everyone is curious who the father is, and I know you probably don't want to talk about that. Does the father know who he is?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and that's why I won't talk about it, because he feels as privately about this child as I do.
What would you do, given this current situation, if they said, if they took away your kids, and then they went one step further and said, we think you're an unfit mother?
We're going to take away this one? I don't know how they're going to do it. What if I'd like to see them try to take this baby from me, and how? How could they do it? They're going to have to wait a long time to do it. Hopefully this thing will be cleared up by then. My children always have been, and having children is, I think being a mother is the most wonderful job that any woman could perform, because it's, like I said, it's not a full replacement. You can never replace a child. I tried to do that with Danny. Danny was a replacement for a child that I had aborted many, many years ago when I was quite young and foolish. And I found at that time when Danny was born that he is a person in himself. You cannot replace a child with a child. They are individuals. And this child is not to replace Cher, never. Cheryl's always going to be with me. How could I replace her? She's still here. But it's somebody to keep me company until Chris and Dan come home.
Half the things that came out of Diane Downs' mouth, I don't think I would ever have the balls to say in the entirety of my life, okay? But her statements do nothing but show you everything you need to know about her and about how she feels in motherhood. Children are there for her and nothing more. They exist to provide her with satisfaction, to fulfill her needs, to make her not feel alone. Diane only knew how to take from people. She never learned how to give. Her children's lives revolved around ensuring their mother's happiness, or else their lives were a living hell. Or she just made a new baby to start all over again. To many, this was a clear manipulation tactic, showing up to her trial where she's accused of murdering and attempting to murder her children pregnant. She knew that it was going to elicit sympathy from jurors, similar to how she had previously used her pregnancies to kind of gain attention and support. And at this time, obviously, crimes did occur, but it was a very different landscape, and you didn't see mothers killing their children as often as you see it now. And so people really could not grasp that this was even a possibility. Now, this trial was significant. They did not allow any recordings. There were people lined up for a chance to get inside. The defense spent the entirety of their argument pretty much grasping at any holes they could find in the case. And they were trying their hardest to portray Diane as a woman who had lived a life full of trauma, of abuse, and neglect. I guess to kind of explain why she was the way she was and how you couldn't kind of compare her and her reactions and all these things people were nitpicking her on because of what she had been through. And the stories she shared were absolutely horrific, but unfortunately, they also kind of reflected Diane's tendency to twist the truth. And so with Diane, there's really no telling what is real and what isn't. I've seen that she allegedly recanted her claims at some point against her father, but even that story bounces back and forth. And I'm not here to judge what did or didn't happen. I obviously cannot say how her life unfolded. But even if all of her claims about her life were true, she still committed the actions that she did against her children. And no matter how much they tried to say that Diane was a great mother and, say that was history, she knew all the things not to do as a mother, there was just overwhelming information from people that had been surrounding her, knowing her personally or just witnessing it as a neighbor, that said that that was not at all the case. And so obviously, people are probably going to believe that Diane is not telling the truth. The defense also tried to argue that the whole situation was just a plot against her, that this was some giant scheme to pin her for the murder and the attempted murder of her children. This was actually something Diane had suggested several times throughout several different scenarios the entirety of the investigation. She had already told the media that she felt that she was being framed, and sometimes it was by whoever committed the crime, sometimes it was by the government, sometimes it was by, the specific sheriff's department. And she'd also mentioned it in her final interview with the police, that big hardball interview that she had. She told them that these men grabbed her arm and shot it, and then said, "Good luck trying to get away with it now." I guess implying that they wanted to frame her, and that was their way of doing it. And honestly, I feel like this is one of the most obvious moments where she's just absolutely full of crap, because it was already kind of unbelievable to authorities and others looking from the outside in that her children would be shot so horrifically and she would only be shot in the arm. But now she's trying to get people to believe that these attackers were like, you know what we're going to do to frame her for this crime? We're going to shoot her in her forearm. Like, it's just like each time her scenarios just get more and more hard to believe and ridiculous. And I don't even think she realized it at this point. And then along the same lines that this was just a big setup, her defense argued that the ballistics, everything that had been found in her home, was planted by authorities. And that makes little sense to me, because they didn't even have the murder weapon. That would be suggesting that the officers that went to her home within like a couple hours of the crime somehow planted ballistics there that matched a gun they still have yet to find. Like, how would that have happened? I mean, the amount of effort that would go into planting that and somehow recreating the grooves from those unfired rounds to perfectly match the ones from the scene. I mean, really sit and think about it for a minute. Why would they go to this much effort to try to frame Diane, a woman they don't even know? Like, I just am not understanding it. And they even claimed that Christie's confession was coercion. All of the times where Diane said she was trying to get the therapists away and all these things was because she believed her children were being brainwashed. She was saying it wasn't because she had anything to hide and that she didn't want Christie to talk. It was because they were telling her that she needed to blame this on her mom. The defense attorney went on to single out and intimidate the detectives, questioning their ethics and protocols after decades of what was exemplary work from what I can see. Anywhere there was a weak spot, he obviously went for it. He also pointed out how there was no gunshot residue on Diane's hands. And he also pointed out that Diane was not covered in her children's blood. Like, there, I guess, was no blood evidence found on Diane. However, I've not really seen anything about blood evidence mentioned anywhere. I didn't see it in the 2020 episode or in the book. I can't find it on Diane Downs' own website, which they have a lot of the, testing, forensic testing and information up there. And so I don't know about that, but I digress. He also argued that the blood found outside of the car came from pulling Cheryl out at the hospital or from the doctors and nurses stepping in pooled blood outside of the car and the chaos of it all. And so, I mean, he did bring forward a handful of good points that I would have questions about too. And then he tried to dissect the timeline, and it just became that much more unbelievable. Like, I already didn't believe what she was saying happened that night, because who goes sightseeing in the dark in the middle of the country? But he added even more unbelievable elements to what she did, trying to account for some of the time, saying that she pulled over, again, in the dark on the side of the road, only a few minutes from home, like 5 minutes from home, to balance her checkbook. Like, no one does that. Like, that is such a load of absolute crap. And like, everyone knows it. Everyone knows that that's absolute crap. And then he proceeded to add minutes here and there, trying to make up for those 25 missing minutes that were unaccounted for. Like, he was adding a few minutes here to when, witnesses saw her arrive at Heather's. So she actually arrived later than she said, and then she left later than she said, and then she arrived to the hospital earlier than she said. I mean, there was not a single shred of evidence to support any of what he was suggesting. He literally was just hoping to sprinkle in minutes here and there, hoping it would close the gaps in the timeline and convince the jury. And then Diane herself took the stand. Diane spoke endlessly about how challenging her life had been, pretty much repeating the same things that she had already told everyone in far more detail. She spoke about how men had harmed her, all of the horrible things that had happened to her. She talked about how happy having children made her, that she would never dream about harming them, that they were the best thing that happened in her life. And if they weren't, she wouldn't have repeatedly had children. She also claimed that she didn't love Nick. I mean, she was really trying to step in and say this whole idea that Nick not wanting children was the motive for this crime. She was trying to put a stop to it. She said that this affair with him was blown out of proportion. It wasn't anywhere near as serious enough for her to ever consider killing her children for him. She went on to say that her other affairs proved that, there was no special connection to him. Yet during cross-examination, she couldn't help but contradict herself. Fred Hughey would repeatedly flaunt in front of her the fact that Steve had told him over and over again he never wanted to be with Diane, and you could just see it like bring this reaction out of her. She got so angry. She was jealous. She was speaking poorly of his wife. Like the moment Fred Hughey introduced back to her all the things that had enraged her before, she couldn't help but become enraged again. But pretty quickly she would like roll herself back in and keep on moving. And then obviously there was no way to get around her own handwritten diaries that made it clear exactly how she really felt for Nick. And there is no way for her to say that these diaries are a facade, that they were, fictional. She had said in several interviews that these diaries were so important to her. It was her way of, coping with her life and figuring out her emotions, and that she never ever thought it would be public information. So obviously this was the truth behind Diane. But the prosecution stepped in and they really started to present an overwhelming amount of evidence. They showcased a near perfect replica of the car. They used the dolls to represent the children. I mean, they examined the trajectory of the bullets. Additionally, they presented a side-by-side comparison of the bullets, comparing the ones from the car, from the crime, to the ones found in the .22 rifle. And the alignment was so precise that you couldn't even tell where one image ended and the other began. Several tests were conducted as well using blood in an attempt to replicate the spatter that was discovered on the outside of the passenger side of the car. And this was something that Diane's attorney had heavily argued, that this was easily put there by pulling Cheryl and Christie's body out of the car. But despite their efforts that included stomping in the blood and dragging bodies out of the vehicle, like the whole 9 yards, none of these methods ever produced the same pattern. The only result that matched was from high velocity spatter. I feel like looking at the photographs, it's obvious to tell that none of them got there from anyone being picked up and taken out of the car, because that portion of the car goes in at an angle. And so anything that fell from above is not going to drip on it. But if something splashed up from below, absolutely. So again, high velocity backspatter. It was from Cheryl being shot in the back. They had also done tests on GSR, staying on someone's hands, and they were not ever able to make any conclusive result. GSR can already be very unreliable because you can get false positives, you can get false negatives, and things like touching different objects, even like your clothing or a door handle, depending on how much is on your hand, can give you a negative result, even if you just held a gun. And so there was no real way to definitively use that test result to say if Diane had held the gun or not. It didn't support either way. They also presented the towel that had been found wrapped around Diane's arm. And she seemed to really focus in on this towel. And I don't know why she did it in all of her interviews. And I kept thinking, even before I got this information, I'm like, she's hyperfixating again. Like there's something about this towel that she doesn't want people to know, because she kept saying, I don't even know how the towel got on my arm. And for months after the towel had been collected, they struggled to decipher the strange pattern of blood on the towel. But Fred Hughey had finally cracked the code. He presented to the jury fold after precise fold, aligning all of the bloodstains until the towel was transformed into a perfectly folded triangle. Diane's claim that she just grabbed this towel haphazardly during the drive and it got on her arm already had been questionable given the lack of blood all around the driver's seat. But now that they have found how this towel was folded, This seemed to suggest that she had it pre-folded, ready to stop her arm from bleeding immediately. Additionally, there was a witness who spoke to Cheryl just days before the shooting. A neighbor living near Willadine and West had spoken to Cheryl about details of her life. She just came like waltzing up to the house and wanted to talk to someone. And she revealed to this woman that her parents were divorced, and she admitted that her mom scared her. She went on to tell this woman a story that happened the night before, which was the 13th, the same day the golden unicorn was dated to, and the same day authorities believed she initially planned to kill her children. Cheryl proceeded to tell this woman that her mother took them to the park at night, which we already knew from the diaries. But she said that her mom was acting strange and then suddenly jumped out at her from behind a tree, like she had been hiding from her. And it scared the crap out of Cheryl. And so the neighbor tried to reassure Cheryl that they were probably just playing hide and seek, but Cheryl's face suggested otherwise. Cheryl seemed to know something was wrong, and the neighbor regretted not speaking up about their conversation. The prosecution also brought forward a psychiatrist that testified, diagnosing Diane with narcissism and histrionic personality disorder, as well as antisocial personality disorder. And I was particularly interested in the histrionic personality disorder because I had never in my whole entire life heard of that before. But when I look it up immediately, the NIH says, quote, "It's a chronic enduring psychiatric condition characterized by a consistent pattern of pervasive attention-seeking behaviors and exaggerated emotional displays." It goes on to further say that a person with histrionic personality disorder seeks attention, talks dramatically with strong opinions, is easily influenced, has rapidly changing emotions, and thinks relationships are closer than they are. And because it's a personality disorder, there is no like treatment that cures it. You can just work on managing it. And so many people believe that she was just wrongfully diagnosed through all the psych evaluations and that she just has an abrasive personality. And that made it seem like she was guilty of harming her kids, that she just doesn't cry. And that doesn't mean she did anything wrong, which I can get that sentiment. But also, when you look at every single detail, several things that she did throughout her life, several things, all showed that she had a huge tendency and pattern of prioritizing her relationship with others, particularly men, ahead of her children. She wanted to be the center of attention. She made it abundantly clear who she prioritized, and that was herself. It was what she wanted, what she thought would benefit her the most. And then finally, the prosecution brought Christie to the stand. It was a very difficult moment. Her foster family was there. They brought one of her foster siblings that she had really closely formed a relationship with to try to help her feel comfortable. But there was not a dry eye throughout the entire courtroom. It was so difficult to hear this little girl sitting on the stand talking about the time where she was shot, how she watched her siblings get shot, and then ultimately say that it was her mom. It was her mom that shot them all. In June of 1984, Diane was found guilty on all charges. And when she left the courtroom, 9 months pregnant, she had a smirk on her face. And reporters asked her, how do you feel? And she just kind of smiled and replied, "What is there to say?" After her conviction, she gave birth to a baby girl who she tried to name after herself. Her full name is Elizabeth Diane Downs. She named her baby Amy Elizabeth. But after a few hours of holding her baby, that child was whisked away to adoptive parents who renamed her Rebecca, and Diane was taken right back to jail. She went on to go to her sentencing, and she received life in prison for the murder of Cheryl, plus 50 years for the attempted murder of Christie and Danny. She showed not a single ounce of emotion yet again. From that point on, Christie and Danny continued to live with their foster parents, and everyone who had been in their lives before seemed to be gone. And it's really hard to tell if that was a choice made by the foster parents or by the courts or how exactly it worked. I know that their grandparents, Wes and Willadine, did try to send things to them, tried to reach out, tried to be in their life, but all of those things were denied. The foster parents sent everything back to them. And also, a lot of it might have to do with the fact that Diane's family at this point strongly started to fight for her release and push that she was innocent. There have been doubts from a few family members, and I know that at least her dad at this point claimed that He no longer believed that she could have anything to do with it, and he wanted to get his daughter released. Danny, as I said, was paralyzed from the chest down, and he learned to navigate life in a wheelchair. Meanwhile, Christie, with a heart of gold, stuck by his side, cared for him and loved him, helping him begin to heal. But she also kind of like re-remembered how to be a kid. Christie realized that it was okay to play, to have fun, and to love. And she understood at that point that pain and torture didn't have to be and wasn't a normal or regular part of life, and that people who love you do not treat you the way that she had been treated. And in the end, Fred Hugie, the prosecutor, and his wife ended up adopting Danny and Christie, which a lot of people who are in support of Diane think was a strategic move, but given Fred's involvement from the first moment he saw those kids on, and it can be vouched for by several people. This was a hard man. This was a man that realized he could never have kids. He loved his job too much. He stood in front of those kids for the first time and cried. And so I feel like he just had this connection with them, and he had made that promise to protect them, and he fully intended on keeping it. But unfortunately, Diane was like a splinter that no one could extract. A few years had passed, and everyone was trying to find a new normal when she escaped from prison. On July 11th, 1987, a Saturday, Diane typically spent her morning sleeping, and instead, she was awake and waiting for the recreation yard to open at 8:30 a.m. And what they didn't know was that she had put on several layers of clothing, several bras, pants, underwear, shirts, to help her scale the 18-foot razor wire fence. There were actually two fences, an interior one and an exterior one, and the first one had a really nasty habit of being overly sensitive. So it was setting off alarms from even a gust of wind. And unfortunately, that meant that 99% of the time, it was just turned off and chalked up to being nothing. No one actually became concerned when it went off. And so Diane was aware of this. She knew that pattern. She watched the pattern of the guards. She learned everyone's routine. And by 8:40 a.m., she was gone. The alarm did in fact go off when she made it over the first fence, but that lack of urgency again worked in her favor. So I believe two staff at the prison kind of like just looked out, peeked out of a door, didn't see anything, so they turned it off. For the next 20 minutes, no one had any idea that Diane was gone, except for two inmates that were friends of hers that watched her scale this wall. And then finally, at around 9 a.m., a nurse pulled into the parking lot and noticed there was someone lying underneath a truck. And obviously, when you work at a prison, you probably want to pay attention to that. So she watched as this person then crawled out, left behind some clothing, and headed off into the woods. Immediately, she ran inside and said, "Diane Downs just escaped." Sure enough, their check of the entire prison couldn't find Diane anywhere, and the shirt that was left behind was actually a shirt that she had worn in one of her most infamous interviews. Officers began searching the surrounding area known as Felony Flats, which had halfway houses, inmates on parole, and families with loved ones in prison, and so they were really concerned that these people are probably going to be more likely to cover for an escapee than the average person. And so they weren't sure they were going to find her. So they started going house to house. They were doing all these searches, and all of a sudden a call came in. A family reported that they had picked up someone they believed was Diane Downs, but they were real confused because they thought she was in prison. This family said they were returning from a camping trip when a distressed woman jumped in front of their car. And the irony of this, by the way, is not lost on me. She didn't give them a chance to say anything, which is her typical MO. Instead, she just got into their car. She began to ramble about a boyfriend of hers who was hurt, and she kept giving off random locations in the area for them to drop her off at. And so ultimately, they dropped her off at 24th and State, which is just blocks away from the prison. But they never saw a man. She just kind of ran off alone. They realized that she looked familiar, and they were thinking it could be Diane, but they couldn't be sure. So once they got home and flipped through, I think, a magazine that had photos of her in it and interviews, they knew for a fact it was her who they had helped. For the next 10 days, it was all hands on deck. The surrogate parents, adoptive parents, Fred Hugie, Steve, Nick, all of them had to be warned that Diane was out and had reason to come after each one of them. Because just days before her release, she had given an interview, and she said that the first thing she was doing when she was released from prison was showing up on Fred Hugie's doorstep. Rebecca, her youngest child that had been adopted when she was being sentenced, had so far been living a life of anonymity. She was in preschool. school, and her family had done everything they could to protect her from the realities of how she was born, all of the details. But now they were in a position where they had to let people know who she was so that others could protect her as well. A choice that should never be forced on them. Fred Hughey, upon hearing this information, grabbed his rifle, grabbed his chair, and posted up at the front door of his home, ready to protect Christie and Danny at any cost. He literally refused to sleep. Night after night, he sat in that chair just in case Diane showed up.
Recognize it to be a shirt belonging to Diane Downs.
Convicted murderer Diane Downs left behind her ripped blouse, evidence of her struggle to break out of the maximum security facility. Prison officials say Downs walked into the unsupervised prison recreation yard early this morning. Apparently, she scaled this 18-foot fence, maneuvered her way over the rolls of razor ribbon, and jumped to freedom. Downs ran along the prison gates and hid under this truck. Moments later, a prison nurse arriving to work spotted Downs and reported it to prison officials. Salem, Marion County, and state police officers joined forces combing the downtown area for Downs. State police dispatched air patrol as well. Officers say the escape was not well planned and Downs could be headed to a number of locations. They're currently checking prison visiting lists and patrolling the areas where most of her friends live. Officers are also stationed near the home of her 2 children, who were adopted last year by Lane County District Attorney. Police say Downs is considered to be dangerous.
I certainly would advise anyone in the area that we have to consider her dangerous because it's pretty common knowledge that she is serving time for murder and attempted murder.
Authorities were worried that she might try to leave the area altogether if she didn't go to all these places. She'd been practicing Spanish, maybe she was going to Mexico, or maybe she went to the Canadian border and headed that way. And then they found her in the craziest way. Investigators decided to go to her room to see if there were any clues there. And they discovered there was a notepad, and it was very obvious on the notepad that something had been written on the top paper, and then that paper was torn off, and indentations from whatever was written were still visible on the paper below. And so they took this and used special forensics to redraw those markings, and it revealed a map. There was the prison on the map and then a straight line to State Street, which is legitimately exactly where she had pretty much been dropped off. And even better, there was an address. And you're never going to believe where she was at. She was just blocks away that entire time at the home of another inmate's husband named Wayne. I mean, how more on brand could she get? She really couldn't. She really couldn't, unless she got pregnant. When authorities arrived, she was very triumphantly and very proud of herself, escorted back to the prison wearing Wayne's boxers and shirt. And the media was everywhere. She loved it. She was smiling. She was having the time of her life. Diana showed up at Wayne's home the day she escaped, naked and in need of a place to stay, which he apparently thought was just great, okay? They spent the next 11 days falling in love with each other. Meanwhile, Wayne's wife was devastated, okay? She's watching her husband confess his love for Diane on the news. Diane was literally a friend of hers in prison. I think they'd even been cellmates at one point. And Diane was flaunting this new relationship as well. I mean, they were talking about getting married. This was like some love story fairy tale for them. And so she was so mad that she decided to come forward to tell authorities what really happened. Wayne's wife apparently had been talking about her marriage and how she felt it was failing. And so, of course, Diane perks up because that's like her favorite topic is other women's husbands. And so after feeling sorry for this woman for a while, she started to say that she needed someone to connect her with a place to stay outside of prison after she attempted her inevitable escape. And so Diane offered this woman a split of $3,000 and a promise not to sleep with her husband if she could convince him to house her. And she's like, oh yeah, I'll tell him all these great things about you, whatever. It was a done deal. Instead, Diane showed up naked for no reason and seduced this woman's husband and then spent the next 11 days having some weird, I don't know, I'm not going to get into the details. What an absolute freaking nightmare. Diane ended up claiming that she had not escaped to reach her kids, which had been everyone's fear. She actually was planning on going to find the real killer that she claimed was in California. She said that she had revenge on her mind at the time, and that was the plan. But I guess, seducing a man and falling in love with him is a lot more fun. So in those 11 days, I guess Wayne decided he loved her enough to pay for 2 private investigators to find this person that she claimed shot her kids. And he went on to profess his love for her all over the media, saying that she was the most honest person he had ever met. Oh boy.
She came over and said that she just got out of prison and Jim let her in. And I said, fine. I was asleep. woke up, asked for me, which is kind of strange. I said she can stay. She just got out of prison. She can, spend a couple nights. I thought she was the most honest girl I'd ever talked to in my life. Doesn't that sound weird?
Maybe not.
I don't know. She was pulling the wool over my eyes. So it was a good trip.
As you can imagine, their love did not last long as it was purely transactional, and Diane received an additional 5 years added to her sentence for her escape. And this man talked on the 2020 episode, and to this day, he's like, oh yeah, that was fun. I didn't give her up because I didn't want to. We had the time of our lives. And he still seems to believe she's the most honest person ever. So I think he may be the only person legitimately in the world that feels that way. But knowing how serious this situation could have been, Fred Hughey petitioned to have Diane moved because if she had escaped once, she could probably do it again, and nothing was stopping her from going the 66 miles to his house to come and get her children. And so to her dismay, she was transferred to Clinton Correctional Facility for women in New Jersey, and she didn't escape again. She has bounced around. I do believe she's in California now, but throughout her time in prison, she was in and out of relationships that she swore would end in marriage. I mean, that was still her top priority, was being with men. Most of the time, these relationships were with other inmates who had charges ranging from murder to SA. She even came close to marrying the I-5 killer at one point, or at least she assumed that it was her he was talking about when he announced that he was getting married. She also pursued an education. I do believe she earned a diploma of some kind, but she spent most of her time trying to get out, not escaping, but the right way, going through the appeals process. But her behavior was just as odd then as well. I mean, she had her attorneys send her the photos of Cheryl's autopsy, and she, according to people at the prison, literally stared at them for hours on end, just sat there looking at pictures of her dead child. And then she proceeded to demand everyone else look at them and was forcefully flashing these photos in front of unexpecting people, causing all sorts of horrific reactions around the prison. But she went on to work on her appeals, and she exhausted all of her appeals at every single level, including a habeas corpus. Every single thing was denied. But she continued from prison, giving interviews and maintaining her innocence. Diane was first eligible for parole in 2008, and I found it interesting watching all of the recordings of this original parole hearing because she stuck to the same original story she told about the one singular shaggy-haired, bushy-haired stranger, but she still, decades later, used the exact same verbiage. It still hasn't changed at all. Almost like it is a script that has been permanently written into her brain. Typically, when I see someone maintain their innocence like that, it gives me pause. I'm like, okay, well, if they are not giving in, or at least saying they don't care anymore, this needs to be looked further into. But I feel like Diane is just so obsessed with winning, so obsessed with having control, that she will do this till the day she dies, even if it's all completely false. She was up for parole again in 2010, but that request was denied as well. And at this point, Oregon law had stated once parole eligibility begins, inmates can reapply every 2 years. However, it was changed to every 10 years, so she was not eligible again until 2020. And she did apply for parole again, and again was denied. And every single time she claimed she had never changed her story. But each time they told her that she had changed her story several times. And according to psych evals, the only thing that hadn't changed was her. Her psychological evaluations stated that most people in circumstances like hers, after spending decades in prison, would start to engage at some point in self-reflection, seek treatment, strive to heal, and improve themselves. And instead, Diane just continued to dig her heels deeper and deeper. They said that in all of the decades that she had been sitting in prison, she had done not a single thing to consider what she did was wrong, to even entertain her guilt and how she ended up in prison to begin with. She had not changed, and they didn't think she ever would. So it was really looking like Diane was never going to get out of prison. Meanwhile, Christie and Danny grew from kids to adults. They continued to live fulfilling lives, choosing to keep their lives private for good reason. They went on to have their own families. They just want to be left alone. And Rebecca, the daughter that Diane was pregnant with during her trial, eventually discovered who her mother was on her own. Her family had tried to protect her, but naturally she was just curious, and learning about Diane terrified her. She worried that sharing the same blood meant she could end up like Diane, and so a whole new story within this gigantic case began, because that fear sent Rebecca spiraling as a teenager. She had never even met Diane face to face. She didn't even know what she looked like until she saw a picture in Small Sacrifices. And that was all it took for her life to be changed. She was having a huge identity crisis. She was scared for her future and her past, and eventually reached out to Diane, hoping to find a connection, a sense of humanity, just something that would ground her and offer reassurance. And at first, Diane played along, but when she realized that she wasn't getting anything from this relationship, she began to say awful things. She told Rebecca that Rebecca wasn't actually her child. She called her a liar. She accused her of being a part of some plot against her, this whole framing thing. And so Diane had yet again traumatized and victimized another one of her children. So just more evidence to show that so much time had passed, decades had passed, and Diane had not changed at all. She was following the exact same patterns. And to those who wonder, why I'm covering such a well-known case, it's because of them, because of Christie and Danny and Rebecca and Cheryl, as well as all of their children, Diane's grandchildren, because they have spent decades trying to move forward, knowing the monster of their past, knowing she's behind bars, the horrors that she committed, having to navigate all of these different parole hearings and appeals. And I feel like most people would think that after this amount of time, that it would be over. But with the recent updates, they are now having to face the very real possibility that Diane could re-enter their lives. Certain jurisdictions, not many, have previously allowed non-unanimous verdicts. So not all juries would need to agree to reach a verdict on someone's guilt in a criminal trial. And that is what happened to Diane in her case. And so it was allowed in Oregon when she was tried in 1984. And as of 2020, only 2 states still allowed non-unanimous verdicts, which included Louisiana and Oregon. Also in 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed that practice through the case of Ramos versus Louisiana. So apparently, the defendant Ramos had been convicted of aiding and abetting attempted murder, among other serious charges, and anywhere else would have called this a mistrial. It was like 10-2 or something like that. And he was sentenced anyway to life without parole. And so he contended that his conviction by a non-unanimous jury violated his Sixth Amendment right, which guarantees the right to a trial by an impartial jury. And one of the requirements underneath that amendment is that the jury's decision has to be unanimous. So how non-unanimous juries were even allowed when it's a constitutional right that it has to be unanimous is beyond me. So obviously, seeing the huge flaw in the justice system, they ruled in his favor. But that also meant a huge change for inmates in both Louisiana and Oregon. And Diane and her attorney saw this and believed that this decision presented an opportunity for her case to be reconsidered. And so Oregon Supreme Court, when this change occurred, stated that, quote, new trials would be required to cure constitutional errors in Oregon cases affected by non-unanimous jury verdicts. Diane and her attorney have filed, as of November 2024, a petition requesting relief from what they see and are calling a wrongful conviction. The only unanimous verdict in Diane's trial was the first count, which was the murder of Cheryl. All of the other charges, it was a non-unanimous jury. And so all of those, if this is accepted, could be overturned. But because Oregon specifically stated that there would need to be retrials for these cases with non-unanimous juries, she might get a retrial just all together. And while all of her appeals and applications for parole have been immediately turned down, this one hasn't, which makes sense because constitutional rights, regardless of how you feel about this case specifically, they can't be messed with like that. And so a judge is giving her attorney an extension to put together evidence. And there is another hearing expected in April. I think it was like April 15th or April 16th. And so a couple months from now, there is such a huge chance that at the very least, a few of her counts can be reversed, or they could just say F it to the whole thing and ask for a retrial. And honestly, I'm not really sure how to think. And the scariest part about this is how seriously and deeply this case affected so many people. And this is not in the news literally anywhere. Like, I had such a challenging time finding information on this. And this is what happens when you have cases that sit for decades. People think that there's nothing else going on. These once sensationalized cases become quiet and no one follows them anymore. And then all of a sudden, this person's released and everyone's like, wait a minute, hold on, we didn't know that was going to happen. Majority of people, including a jury, several appeals, federal courts, believe that she received proper conviction and sentencing. They believe that she committed this crime and she is properly serving the time for it. However, there are still lots of individuals who strongly believe she is innocent. Her family has a website, among other initiatives to fight for her release. I believe her father passed away in 2017, and that entire time, he did nothing but run this website and collect evidence and analyze and all of these things. And they claim that this is all, again, a botched investigation. Diane was framed. They've claimed that evidence was withheld. They've identified a person they believe is responsible, asserting that he confessed. And they've also scrutinized Christie's testimony, questioning what she saw and saying she was coerced and that she was lying, which is just devastating because it feels like her family is victimizing her all over again. And I feel like after decades and decades, having grown into an adult, that if something had been wrong with her testimony, if she had been pushed in a corner, that she would have come forward and said, hey, I was a kid. I was horribly mistreated and forced to do something that I didn't want to do. None of this is real. But it's just not happened. Diane did state in one of her parole hearings that Christie, I guess, had recanted to two of her friends that were siblings in school one time, that it wasn't her mom that shot her. But again, it's kind of hard to look at that one instance and negate 40 some years that she's failed to say that ever again, failed to come forward as an adult. After reading some of her appeal documents, it's also pretty clear that a lot of the concerns raised by her family, a lot of these things that they feel prove she's not responsible, have already been addressed through the appeals process, particularly her habeas corpus. However, every single time it seems that there has never been enough evidential backing presented for any judge at any level to consider an appeal or grant parole. So right now, it just doesn't seem there's anything there to prove these things are true. The Innocence Project also refused to take the case, and they love a big sensationalized case to try to turn on its head. So I also just feel like they wouldn't have turned this down unless they truly thought there wasn't anything there to grasp onto. I ultimately just don't see Diane ending her fight anytime soon, and their current efforts really show that, and things might drastically change in the next few months. I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on this case. I want to know if any of you guys strongly feel like she's actually not guilty, like she was framed, and I want to hear exactly why you think that. There's just so much that goes into this, and our judicial system and our forensics and everything changes so rapidly. And so looking at a case from all the way back in 1984 and seeing how things were handled then, how they could have been handled now, honestly, it just makes me appreciative of advancements in technology. I'll update you with what happens from here. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to this absolutely twisted, long, detailed story. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam so we can bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.